Our fourth speaker, as I said, final speaker of this morning's session is Dr. Niamh Marnham, an architectural historian and built heritage consultant at Howley Hayes Conroy Cooney Architects. She has an in-depth knowledge of building types, periods and typologies in both Britain and Ireland, and knows Leinster House particularly well, as it formed the subject of her PhD. She's the author of An Introduction to the Architectural Heritage of Dublin South City, which I think was the first, was it? The first volume in the NIAH series to deal with Dublin. Another assiduous user of the archive here, she is speaking to us today on that transformative period when the RDS were in residence in Leinster House. Stair wars, territorial claims in the expansion of Leinster House as a cultural and scientific complex.
Hello, thank you, Colin, and thank you for coming this afternoon. And thanks, Dennis, for inviting me to speak on the subject of Leinster House. As Colin said, it was the subject of my PhD for the Office of Public Works, and centred on the making of the Leinster House cultural and political complex from 1815 to 1924. And obviously there's a huge amount that I could say on the subject, but I'll spare you four years of detail. But it's very much a whistle-stop tour of the tenure of the Royal Dublin Society, or the Dublin Society initially, on the site from 1815, and then the subsequent struggles that took place for the control of Irish science and arts education and the collections and buildings that house them and the run-up to Home Rule. So this is today. This is the Leinster House site. It's a site we're all very familiar with. It forms the backdrop of our daily news reports. But in a way, I feel it's a very underappreciated and misunderstood site. It's the site of the seat of our Oireachtas, the Senate, and the Dáil. It's the principal locus of our main national cultural institutions: the Natural History Museum, the National Gallery, the National Library, and the National Museum of Ireland. And as I say, this one's very familiar but underappreciated. Why does it look as it does? It's an enormously textured and complex landscape, the product of many hands and multiple tensions that forged and shaped it, both deliberate and accidental, sometimes cooperational and sometimes oppositional. It's the place where many ideas about emergent national and cultural identity were tested and forged, and it's also the place where, as we know, the nation came to reside. This I use as a useful sort of outline of the key moments in the site's history, some of which have obviously been touched on earlier this morning. Obviously, from 1745, the first Duke of Leinster starts construction on Leinster House. Subsequent to that, the RDS occupied it as their HQ from 1815 to 1924. And then from the 1850s, there was increasing sort of government control exercise from Westminster in terms of controlling over the funding and the absorbing of indigenous collections and the buildings that were to house them. And obviously, finally, the last act by the British government on the site was the construction of, firstly, the Royal College of Science of Ireland, which is the orange block here. And then finally, 1917 to 1922 was government buildings. This Kieran's already touched on before. This is Augustus Frederick Fitzgerald, who, as Daniel O'Connell, dubbed him the most miserable of miserable dukes. I don't know, Kieran, if you can shed any light on that. But, as you say, he was the grandson of the first Duke, James Fitzgerald, and Lady Emily Lennox. And he sold Leinster House to the Dublin Society following the Act of Union for a song, really, £10,000 and an annual rent of £600. And as you said, Leinster House had fallen into quite a sort of state of dilapidation, and perhaps was never really greatly loved by the Kildare family. And it was not actually the end of his influence on the site in Dublin, as we will see later. The Dublin Society had lost much of its funding following the Act of Union and was struggling to survive, so it was very grateful to receive the opportunity to have such an august location as Leinster House for it to hold its meetings and to do the business of the society. And the society itself was known as the Royal Dublin Society from 1820, and from its inception in the 18th century, was largely the preserve of the Protestant landed elite, though not exclusively. It was a pioneering semi-private indigenous society founded under the Irish Parliament in 1731 with the explicit aims to Enlightenment principles on the aims to improve Ireland's economic condition by promoting the development of agriculture, arts, industry and science. And it had an incredibly highly regarded drawing and modelling school before the RDS came to the Leinster House site, and had world-class collections that were the envy of London. And they developed also the botanic gardens from the 1790s. And the society was open at that point to all creeds and originally had held many public lectures. This is the original entrance to Leinster House, and it's sort of very elegant neoclassical sort of rusticated gate that was swept away later by the development of the National Museum and National Library in around 1890. This is a view from the Dublin Penny Journal of 1835. It's essentially 20 years after the RDS took over Leinster House. As you can see, it was much more spatially and visually kind of less separate than it is today. And the lawn was actually in quite a dilapidated state, and that very much reflects the kind of the state that Leinster House was in at the point at which it was sold. The RDS held their triennial exhibition of industry at Leinster House on the complex from 1838, and the first horse show was held there in 1864. It's quite extraordinary to imagine horses cantering around Leinster lawn. This is again back to the RDS's kind of work from the 18th century onwards. They had a very pioneering drawing and modelling schools that gave tuition in architecture, sculpture and painting from the 1760s with illustrious former pupils, including actually James Hoban in the 1780s, who went on, as we know, to design the White House. This is kind of quite an instructive detail from the 1846 Ordnance Survey map, and shows the new drawing school, which is to the north of Leinster House here, and that was designed by Henry Aaron Baker and extended by Papworth in 1840, I understand. And as Kieran has said, the RDS's Jolie Library was originally, the collection was originally located in what is the Abbot's End there, the Senate end of Leinster House, and then subsequently went on to form the core of the National Library's collection in 1890. Again, the next important development on the site was very much informed by Prince Albert and Queen Victoria's husband and his great exhibition in London in Hyde Park in 1851. It was a highly influential economic sort of posturing and grandstanding on the part of the government, but it was also a means of sort of trying to keep England and the Union keeping England as kind of economically advantageous over Prussia and France. And it kind of pioneered very much new ideas about display, but also the more egalitarian educational role of museums in society. And out of the Great Exhibition grew the South Kensington Department of Science and Art, which was intended to foster a network of local and metropolitan schools of artistic, scientific and technical education as a means of providing universal access of education, but also of keeping Britain economically competitive. So this in turn led to the development of Albertopolis, or the South Kensington Museums area, which developed from 1857 to 1907. And it was a culture centre conceived by Prince Albert and Henry Cole, who was the first director of the South Kensington Museum, very much on the lines of German models, sort of a contiguous juxtaposition of teaching institutions and their illustrative collections. So you see here this building there, all buildings are kind of contiguously located. This is just down the road from where the Great Exhibition was just held. And the first phase of it was the South Kensington Museum over to the extreme right. There was a gradual takeover of the RDS by South Kensington in the 19th century as it progressed. And they, as I said, wanted both universal access and economic control. And they gradually subsumed, augmented, and made more publicly accessible the RDS's buildings and collections. And this was our own riposte, post-famine, to the battered Irish post-famine psyche, really. This was Ireland's riposte to the Crystal Palace. It captures a critical point in the site's history, as it represents the cusp of change, the point before the old order, in the form of the RDS, ceded local agency over science and art education to the Empire, as represented by South Kensington, and so began a descent into sort of infighting and factionalism in a lot of Dublin's early societies, and against South Kensington and the Treasury. It's extraordinary to think of that structure enveloping again all of Leinster law, and it was designed by the Cork-born architect engineer John Benson, and it was constructed of painted laminated wood with cast iron columns, and it had four halls. And unlike the Hyde Park exhibition had a dedicated fine art hall, the exhibition was conceived and funded entirely by William Dargan, the so-called father of the Irish Railways, but very much in close cooperation with those who had worked at Crystal Palace and had organised Crystal Palace, and also in cooperation with the RDS. The Great Hall, which as you see there, the sort of facets of the sort of Islamic architecture, but the Great Hall has a real miscellany of Irish and British projects: telescopes, fireplaces, harps, Celtic high crosses, textiles, and statuary. And again, that's another view from street level of the Great and Good arriving for the exhibition. And actually, interestingly, in this, I find this image. On Upper Marion Street, there's houses which are no longer there. There was 13 later on, 13 houses that were demolished for the construction of government buildings. And again, this is an interior view of the Fine Art Hall, painted by James O'Mahony, and it's a depiction of obviously Victoria and Prince Albert arriving to view the hall. And they made 4 visits. And the Great and the Good flocked to catch a glimpse of the Queen, apparently, who she made 4 visits, and they, on the days that she visited, parasols and umbrellas were not permitted on the days that she was visiting. Of the exhibition buildings, Victoria recorded in her private diary that they are ugly on the outside, but very fine on the interior. So, in a way, this exhibition made urgent the desire for a sort of permanent national gallery in Dublin. And then again, reflecting sort of increasing political tensions, everything on the site from this point on was politicised, and controversy surrounded the choice of the site, the architect, materials, and especially the collections and the buildings that were to house and that were to represent the nation. The first of which, this actually the perspectival drawing was sort of drawn to show, it was kind of a piece of visual trickery to show that both the Natural History Museum here on the left and the first phase of the National Gallery on the right were, supposed to be in alignment or on axis with Leinster House, but they weren't in fact. The Natural History Museum was completed in 1856 by the Oxford Works architect, or Border Works architect, Frederick Villiers Clarendon. And then this is it on the right in the 1880s, so that's the first floor gallery. And then the Natural History Museum on the right, or the first phase of it, the National Gallery on the right, was designed by Francis Folk, who was an Irish-born engineer who had in fact built the first phase of the South Kensington Museum in the 1850s as well. And he was parachuted in amid great controversy to design the first phase, and it was to harmonise with Leinster House. Both buildings had sort of very muted Palladian skin, unlike the message in South Kensington, which was very much about sort of the application of ornament and art that was to kind of showcase what South Kensington is about. This was very much designed to harmonise with Leinster House. And again, that shows the muted Palladian skin there of the southern, I think it's I can't remember which elevation that is of the museum, but it is very muted, sort of Palladian sort of rendering. And again, the gallery was intended to be a monument to William Dargan in gratitude for his heroic work in bringing off the Great Dublin Exhibition. And it was called the Irish National Gallery from the outset, almost 60 years before the foundation of the state. And it was the first permanent manifestation or the expression on the site of a distinct, separate national identity, and it was proto-national and anti-pragmatic in nature. And again, this is back to the Fitzgeralds on the site, and this the next big event to happen on the site was the Marquess of Kildare's recommendation to this gentleman on the left to concentrate science and art institutions on the Leinster House site, very much against his father, Augustus Frederick's wishes. He first, Charles William Fitzgerald, advocated a great national department of science and art managed completely by Irishmen. But then, against his father's wishes, Augustus Frederick was the chair of the Royal Irish Institution. He wanted an entirely locally run body analogous to South Kensington, but on the Earlsford Terrace site, which had been the site of a more recent industrial exhibition. And the Marquess wanted sisterly connection, but not to be subordinated by South Kensington. That's what he wanted initially. But then he did a complete volte-face, in fact, and publicly upended the family order, following advice that Irish students would lose out if they didn't compete as part of an imperial apparatus, and then now advocated a department run by South Kensington on the Leinster House grounds. And to quote, he proposed to concentrate all science and art institutions established in Dublin in one building and to create a science and art museum worthy of Dublin on the site occupied by the RDS. Naturally, this didn't go down well with many quarters. This is what the original, the original proposal to concentrate, contiguously concentrate cultural institutions looked like, and thankfully it went unrealised. As you can see at the front here, where Leinster Lawn is, they were proposing to have a block running completely across it that would obviously have blocked the entirety of Leinster House and obviously Leinster Lawn. It was not, however, until the passing of the Dublin Science and Art Museums Act of 1877 that South Kensington formally took over Science and Arts Institutes and state-run museums and subsumed the collections and the buildings of the RDS, which were then also augmented by the RIA and TCD traditional collections. And this is quite an interesting image from 1879, and it shows not only the lecture theatre here to the left of the image next to Leinster House, which was then to come with later the Dóla Chamber. It shows the Shelburne Hall and the Agricultural Hall, and the Agricultural Hall was just in part dismantled and re-erected in Bolsford when the RDS moved in 1924. And the Shelburne Hall had been the site of, the Agricultural Hall had housed the 1861 exhibition. Again, this image here is a cartoon from April 1883 from the Diamond magazine. It's a caricature of Dr. William Steele, who was a former RGS man who became the first director of the Dublin Science and Arts Museum. And the cartoon is very much lampooning what some perceived as the joint antics of the South Kensington Department and the RGS, and what was perceived as the plundering and centralising of the collections of many of the learned societies to fill the new museum. And then this very public battle then that ensued between factions of the RDS and the Dublin branch of South Kensington played out rather sadly in the temporary carving up of space both in Leinster House for both the RDS and South Kensington. The green was the RDS, it was obviously just the first floor plan, this was similar on each floor, and pink was South Kensington. And as you can see, there was a sort of a a screen that was going up the principal staircase at one point. And so the battle for space here was arguably one of the most symbolic that took place, and illustrates, as I said, the nadir in the relations between some factions of the RDS and the government in their failing battle to retain power following the 1877 Act. An Irish Times editorial at the time said of it, it is a miserable arrangement, unworthy of both the Society and the Department, and however the matter is settled, thus splitting up the historic mansion, even for decency's sake, should be avoided. Would it not be a curious reproach if, under the Corporation Improvement Bill 1890-1, when passed, that the first tenement house placed upon the new register should be Leinster House? So this is an image, a rendering by Dean and Son of the finalised contiguous culture centre on the Leinster House site. It's from the Irish Building from 1883, and it's 3 years after their completion of the museum and the library. The museum to the right and the library to the left. And 25 years since the Marquess's recommendation that a nexus of cultural institutions, yes, it's the Marquess's recommendation. And sort of Prince Albert is at the centre of Leinster law at that point, and Dargan is outside his by now highly successful legacy, the National Gallery. There was a huge furore that surrounded the competitions to build the buildings that were to represent, in fact, the nation, the National Museum and the Library, particularly the National Museum. And in 1881, there was a competition which was aborted after it was found that no Irish architects were shortlisted. However, it had been shortlisted by an all-Irish panel that included the president of the RIAI. And in many ways, the whole battle was more about sort of getting work for architects, and treasury parsimony. And ultimately, treasury parsimony was the reason that Thomas Manley and T.M. Dean and some were eventually selected. And their buildings, they're very stylistically eclectic. They're quite loud. They're not their preferred or their best Gothic revival idiom, but largely do harmonise with Leinster House. This is what we could have had if what was built from the first competition had been built. This is Richard Neil Freeman's winning design, and it's sort of the second Empire style. I'm quite glad we didn't get that. And again, this is a ground plan showing the deans their proposals for the site and the plan, which necessitated the destruction or the demolition of quite a number of Georgian houses on Kildare Street. And you can also see in this image that the lecture theatre of the RDS is there beside Leinster House before it was actually transferred to the Dáil in 1924. And again, this is an image of a site image from the museum being built. It was built by Beckett and Sons, Beckett's father, who ran the building company, and that could conceivably be him in the bowler hat. I haven't quite been able to verify that, but I'd like to. And then this government buildings this is 1922, and that was the last act of the government on the site, and in terms of consciously clustering science and art institutions around Leinster House. So government buildings of the latter phase, the Royal College of Science was behind it, built from 1904 to 1911. But both buildings really were the architectural swan song of the British government in Ireland, and finished by the Free State. They were sort of bombastic historicist clothes that the Empire had only decided what it looked like as it was beginning to unravel, really. Though it did sort of mask quite a innovative structural skeleton internally. The College of Science that was behind, I don't actually have an image of it here, but the College of Science was, again, very innovative, and it was open to both sexes and all religions, botany, physics, applied physics, and its purpose was largely to supply teachers for Empire. So a huge debate had surrounded where the new college should be located, if a modern art gallery should be included, and what or whether any Irish architect had a suitable track record for designing such a specialist building. And ultimately, no competition was held. And this again, perhaps this did represent what was going on politically in a more sort of naked way. So Aston Webb, who had refronted Buckingham Palace and designed Admiralty Arch and the University of Birmingham, was appointed. He was a sort of Westminster darling, and he was appointed by Horace Plunkett, who was the head of the Department of Agriculture, Trade and Industry, and in liaison with the Treasury. So there's a lot about money really in terms of who was going to design this. But Thomas Manley Dean worked only as an executive architect on the project, but he was the main guy who carried out the works, and Aston Webb actually never came to site. So, as I hope it's been very much a whistle-stop tour, as I said, but the resultant architecture and the complex as a whole is therefore very emblematic of multiple forces competing for control. The beleaguered RDS, who had instituted such pioneering works, who were struggling, to maintain their own identity in a changing Ireland, representing the indigenous elites and wanting to retain some influence in Irish society under Westminster. And then also the South Kensington Department, who wanted to make such facilities more freely available to all for the betterment of the Union, and the parsimonious Treasury, who never wanted to spend much on such buildings. And then obviously the competing architecture profession, who wanted to win the commission in what was a complex and at times deeply flawed system of procurement. Thanks very much.